I think my voice is audible to all of you. So in the previous class, we were discussing about the cyber sickness model. Is it clear? So where we have seen neural conflict, I think user degree of interactivity. So I think we have discussed degree of interactivity. So for that, an example was also considered. So that example is 3D navigation in image. Just a minute, please. Okay, I'm audible now. Sorry, a small interruption here. So in the previous class, we also discussed about the neural conflict, in which we have taken this neural conflict, nothing but sensorial rearrangements, are taken into three types. One is type 1, type 2, type 3. So these things also we discussed in the previous class. And the other one is there, simulation session duration. Simply we can say that the influence of simulation duration, this is very important. Influence of simulation duration. So you can say influence of simulation duration. And then nothing but for how much time we are experiencing that simulation in virtual VR. That is also more important. So the task considered by University of Central Florida, Kennedy, in the year 2000. So they did one small task. That task is nothing but flying a helicopter, and subjects were military pilots. So subjects were what? Military pilots. So the data was divided according to duration. Simulation session of 1 hour or less, 1 hour to 2 hours as one data set, 2 to 3 hours as another data set, simulation session of 1 hour or less, like this, and simulation session of over 3 hours. So like that, 4 types of data sets were considered while experimenting, and that too, the military people or military pilots experiencing nothing but flying a helicopter. So these results showed that there is a linear relationship between the duration of simulation and the degree of simulation sickness. So when we say that there is a relation, a linear relationship, see, mathematically it is not shown here. Experimental results show that linear relationship between duration of simulation and the degree of simulation sickness. So hence, we need to see that the duration of initial exposure should be limited to minimize the discomfort. So to minimize the discomfort, definitely the duration of initial exposure should be limited. So if you draw the graph between average total sickness score with respect to the flight session duration, you observe that it's going on increasing. It's going on increasing. So we say that it's a linear relation. Definitely there is a linear relation here. Next one, we discuss about, let us see, prior experience and adaptation. Okay. Influence of repeated exposure. So again, one more study was done at the University of Central Florida in Kennedy. That is, the people are enrolled, Kennedy and his colleagues. That study is nothing but influence of user adaptation on cyber sickness. User adaptation. Adaptation in the sense, for example, a particular technology, when we are habituating that technology, that is also more important. So, user adaptation based cheskoni etla influence avutundi anedi more important here. Is it clear? So, since prior neural images play such an important role in cyber sickness, can repeated exposure to VR desensitize the user. Ante ikkada meaning endante, please do remember, prior neural images play such an important role in cyber sickness. That means what? Prior knowledge or prior exposure, you can say. So again, the study looked at military helicopter simulators. Again, the subjects were pilots here, and the task was prone to induce sickness. The task was what? Prone to induce sickness. So this particular study used a total sickness score with the 35% as 0 point. Thus, for military point pilots, 35% incidence of simulator sickness is considered acceptable. If the sickness score is 35%, especially for military pilots, that is always considerable. And for the general public, it is not. Because military pilots, as they do get exposed, and also they do have a practice, very much practice in real, is clear. So even if 35% sickness score is there for the pilots, that is not at all dangerous for them. So it is acceptable for us. But the same score, if you take it for public, so it is not at all an acceptable format. Is clear? So the results showed that a significant reduction in TSS. What is this TSS? It's nothing but total sickness score. Total sickness score. After a few flights showing that the subject had adapted to the neural mismatch. While mismatches exist, they are considered as matches due to prior experience. See here, the study here, average total sickness score and flight numbers. For the first flight number 1, the sickness score is nearly 20, and as you go on, the flight numbers increase. You observe that sickness score is nearing to 0. So the study did not indicate how long the subsequent exposure should be, nor over what time interval they should take place. It is believed that no more than 1 week should separate simulation sessions. So that means here the concentration is only on repeated exposure, not what we can say the duration of that exposure. Is it clear? In the duration, 1 hour duration or 2 hour duration, if I am considered, that is not at all included here. Only thing it is believed here, it is no more than 1 week should separate simulation sessions. If you see here, the results showed a significant reduction in the TSS after a few flights, showing that the subjects had adapted to the neural mismatch. Even the public also, first time on a flight journey, they said, "Koncham nervous." Second time, that may be a little bit decreased. Like that, if you travel more number of times, then that traveling in a flight or going in a flight is as usual like that of a traveling in a bus or stage వచ్చేస్తుంది. సో సిక్నెస్ స్కోర్ అనేది ఇనిషియల్ గా ఎక్కువ ఉంటుంది, బట్ as you go on increase that number of flights, is clear, then in that case definitely the sickness score will be reduced. Is clear? Now I hope you understand repeated exposure influence ఎలా ఉంది సైబర్ సిక్నెస్ మీద. సో రిపీటెడ్ గా జర్నీ చేస్తున్నా, రిపీటెడ్ గా పైలట్స్ మనం హెలికాప్టర్ లో జర్నీ చేసినా లేదా ఏరోప్లేన్స్ లో జర్నీ చేసినా కూడా డెఫినెట్లీ ఇనిషియల్ గా ఉన్నంత సిక్నెస్ తర్వాత ఉండదు. దట్ ఈస్ వాట్ ఇట్ ఈస్ దిస్ రిజల్ట్ షో. నౌ కమింగ్ టు అడాప్టేషన్. Definition as per VR for adaptation is adaptation to sensory rearrangement. Please do remember, adaptation to sensory rearrangement is a semi-permanent change of perception or even perceptual motor coordination that serves to reduce or eliminate a registered discrepancy between or within sensory modalities or the errors in behavior induced by this discrepancy. So adaptation to what? Actually మన adaptation, say here the example shown here, you can see before VR exposure, initial mapping through artificial offset, then adapted grasping, and then after effects. This is how you can observe. Is it clear? So adaptation ఇక్కడ ఏంటంటే దేనికి for what we are going to consider this particular adaptation means sensory rearrangement. This is what we are going to consider adaptation to sensory rearrangement. This particular adaptation to this sensory rearrangement is nothing but a semi-permanent change of perception. అంటే పర్సెప్షన్ మనకు ఫర్ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ ఇక్కడ ఒక ఆబ్జెక్ట్ పట్టుకున్నట్టు చూపిస్తున్నాం. ఇది క్లియర్? ఇనిషియల్ గా బిఫోర్ విఆర్ అంటే వితౌట్ ఎనీ హెచ్ఎండి స్ట్రైట్ అవే విల్ go and pick that particular object. Straight away will directly, please observe, this is what. Is clear? Now initial ga when we are doing mapping through artificial offset యూజ్ చేసేటప్పుడు ఒకసారి మనం ఇట్లా మూవ్ అవ్వచ్చు అంటే we are using HMD display కాబట్టి HMD device వాడుతున్నప్పుడు straight away our hand will not go to this particular point. See here, ఇటు పోయినట్టు అనిపిస్తుంది లేదా ముందుకు పోయినట్టు, this type of things you are going to get. అంటే ఇక్కడ సెన్సార్స్ అనేది రీఅరేంజ్ చేసుకోగలుగుతున్నాము త్రూ ద హెడ్ మౌంటెడ్ డిస్ప్లే. clear? Now adapted grasping, adapt అయిన తర్వాత clear, you can observe even మన హ్యాండ్ ఇక్కడ మూవ్ అయినప్పుడు కూడా you observe that our hand is seen to be near to the object and touching this particular button. Is it clear? So this what? Semi-permanent change of perception that serves to reduce or eliminate a registered discrepancy between or within sensory modalities or the errors in behavior induced by this discrepancy. So adaptation అనేది కూడా కొంచెం ఇంపార్టెంట్ అండి ఇన్ వర్చువల్ రియాలిటీలో, బికాస్ any new technology that is there, so we have to get it, what we can say, it should be used by us without any prior first point, without any confusion, without any lag. ఇట్లాంటివన్నీ కూడా కన్సిడర్ చేయాల్సి వస్తుంది. అంటే కొంచెం అడాప్ట్ అవ్వాలి ఆ పర్టికులర్ సిస్టమ్కి. అడాప్ట్ అయ్యేటప్పుడు కొన్ని చేంజెస్ ఉంటాయి. ఆ చేంజెస్ ని మనం ఏం చేస్తున్నాం, వీఆర్ ట్రైంగ్ టు రెక్టిఫై దట్ ఆర్ వీఆర్ ట్రైంగ్ టు ఓవర్కమ్ దట్ త్రూ వాట్ సెన్సరీ రీఅరేంజ్మెంట్. దీన్నే మనం ఇక్కడ అడాప్టేషన్ టు సెన్సరీ రీఅరేంజ్మెంట్ అంటాం. This particular image, 4 images may give you a little bit insight about what is adaptation. ఇక్కడ ఎగ్జాంపుల్ ఏంటంటే హ్యాండ్ ఐ కోఆర్డినేషన్ అడాప్టేషన్. Is it clear? That is what about prior experience and similar adaptation Next one is after effects. After effects means generally this is induced through adaptation to neural conflicts, and this particular thing occur after the simulation session ended and can last for hours or days. After effects and then let us assume that we have experienced that what I can say roller coaster example kaavachu, flight simulation kaavachu, or even any other virtual experience. So virtual experience అయిన తర్వాత experience చేసేసి మళ్ళీ బయటకు వచ్చిన తర్వాత some people may still they do have that illusion, అంటే ఇంకా ఎక్స్పీరియన్స్ అవుతున్నట్టే ఉండొచ్చు లేదా కళ్ళు తిరుగుతున్నట్టు అనిపించచ్చు ఆఫ్టర్ even after experiencing that VR. So that is very important here, even for some group of people also, or for group of subjects. So that is why we consider all those things as what after effects here. And these after effects are induced through adaptation to neural complex. And these particular after effects occur after the simulation session ended and can last for hours or days. Even while adaptation is good, and then మనం adapt అవుతున్నాం particular technology, even though that is good, but after experiencing that and the simulation session ended, so definitely those after effects may be sometimes bad for us. Forms of after effects are what? The flashbacks, sensation of self motion. ఒకసారి మూవ్ అవుతున్నట్టు అంటే even though we are not we are out of that particular virtual reality environment, so we do have a feeling of what ఇంకా ఏదో మూవ్ అవుతున్నట్టు లేదా ఇంకా ఆ పర్టికులర్ ఎన్విరాన్మెంట్ లోనే ఉంటున్నట్టు. We do think like that. These things are what called as flashbacks, and even sensation of self motion. So these are some forms of what after effects. After effect అనేది రెండు రకాలుగా ఉంటుంది, and sometimes it may be headache and head spinning, తల తిరుగుతుండడం. Is it clear? Diminished hand-eye coordination, vestibular disturbances. So these are all what different forms of after effects, and these will lead to what Navy and Marines to institute grounding policies, especially Navy and Marine, naval కానీ లేదా marine technologies లో కానీ లేదా marine fields లో. So these are definitely considered very important, because in this type of applications like naval applications or marine applications, so they need to institute grounding policies after simulator flights. Other bans may be necessary, example driving, biking, roof repair, operating machinery, etc. Even the కొంచెం what we can say పెద్దగా కన్సిడర్ చేయాల్సిన అవసరం లేదు. But in general, this one simple application where we are going to concentrate more on after effects is what naval applications and marine applications. So అక్కడ కొన్ని పాలసీస్ ఫ్రేమ్ చేయాల్సి వస్తుంది సిమ్యులేటర్ ఫ్లైట్స్ చేసుకుంటాం, because the person should not be there continuously in that illusion. So these are the certain guidelines framed for the proper VR usage. So it is meant to minimize the onset and severity of cyber sickness. They are largely qualitative. So during system development of we need to see that latencies should be minimized and they should be stable. And then a particular virtual environment design చేసేటప్పుడు, please I request remember that while developing any VR virtual reality, so we have to minimize or we have to see that all these guidelines to be followed. First point ఏంటంటే during system of development, దాంట్లో minimize latencies, తక్కువ latencies అనే కాన్సెప్ట్ ఆల్రెడీ మనం విన్నాం. They should be minimized and we need to make them stable. So we should not have any pulsating light sources of low frequency, and we should see that the spatial frequency should be reduced in large displays. Even proper alignment of optics and sufficient resolution is to be considered in HMDs, and we need to see that intensity is to be reduced and duration of loud 3D sound sources. And intensity of 3D sound gaani, duration of 3D sound sources, these must be reduced. So if ఒకవేళ reduce చేయలేదు అనుకోండి, continuous గా intensity of 3D sound is very large and duration is also very large. So we observe that. So we are going to get some problems with auditory systems. So to avoid that, it is must to have reduction in the intensity and duration of 3D sound sources. and we need to use accurate trackers, and we need to remove sources of interference. There should not be any source of interference. It is very important. We need to see that consistency should be there in the multi-model display. So these are the 7 points which we need to consider while designing or developing any virtual reality model. After this development, we need to consider even some more points during immersion, before immersion, let us say. The screen users, whenever possible, for susceptibility to cyber sickness, we should have warning labels. And screen users ఎవరెవరు అనేది కూడా మనం ఐడెంటిఫై చేయాలి. వార్నింగ్ లేబుల్స్ అనేది కూడా మనం ఇండికేట్ చేయాలి. And we need to educate the users of potential adverse effects from VR exposure. And we should see that the exposure should be limited to users that are free from drugs and alcohol consumption. So the subjects which we are going to consider while experimenting, they should not have any sort of drug addicted and alcohol consumption. So before exposing that particular VR technology, we should see that the users have to be encouraged. Those who are having a cold, flu, and some sort of binocular anomalies, or susceptibility to migraines, or photic seizures, etc. So we should not make them to use this VR. So we should discourage people who are having problems with, or who are having problems like cold, flu, binocular anomalies, susceptibility to migraines. That means those who are already having migraines, or even photic seizures. The people with all these particular characteristics should not be allowed to use VR. That means we need to discourage these particular type of people. So before immersion, these are the points. And during immersion, we need to follow the points as shown here. Provide proper airflow and comfortable air temperature. We should ensure equipment fits user comfortability through necessary adjustments. That means what? Either HMD device kaavachu, hand controllers kaavachu, avani correct ga fit avutunna ledha particular user. That we need to check. And we need to minimize initial exposure time for strong stimuli. And we need to see that monitor users for signs of sickness. Should monitor the users who are experiencing VR, whether they do have signs of cyber sickness or not. And we should inform the users they can or they should continue the simulation if they so wish. So we have to inform that the user should definitely, if they are not good to experience VR, they may skip or they may come out of that simulation comfortably. That means they can discontinue the simulation. So like this, 5 points are to be considered during immersion. Similarly, after immersion, this is also very important. So we should measure user hand-eye coordination and postural stability. Hand-eye coordination, whether it is good or not, and whether our stability posture is good or not, we need to measure it. And we should introduce a time period immediately after VR exposure in which users are not allowed to perform high-risk activities. So definitely there should be a time period for each and every VR exposure. So if possible, we can re-immerse users in a readaptation or simulation. And if it is necessary, it is to be followed up with users to monitor prolonged after effects. And we should see that intersession period should be introduced for about 3 to 5 days. Like this, these are the steps which we need to consider during immersion, after immersion, during immersion, after immersion. Before that, points related to development, before immersion, during immersion, and after immersion. So with that, the health and safety aspects are finished. I hope you understand. once again repeat the cyber sickness model with the different steps involved. So here we are going to consider repeated exposure. This repeated exposure will definitely help us to reduce the total sickness score. Examples considered are what? Military helicopter simulators, and of course the subjects were pilots. And the study used a total sickness score with 35% as 0 point. That means 35% is taken as the initial limit or the base limit for cyber sickness, especially for military application. So thus for military pilots, 35% of incidence of simulation sickness is considered acceptable. For the general public, we are not going to consider this one. Similarly, results showed that a significant reduction in the TSS after a few flights, showing that the subjects have adapted to the neural mismatch. Similarly, adaptation, and then after effects we have seen. After effects forms and flashback sensation of self motion or headache and head spinning like that, diminished hand-eye coordination and vestibular disturbances. So these are the guidelines for proper VR research during system development, before immersion, after immersion, during immersion, etc. I think this is not included in your syllabus. As far as my opinion, the last topic of your 5th unit is this one, cyber sickness, after effects like this. With this, the syllabus part is completed. Social implications are not included here. Just a minute.